In the soft, fading light of a November afternoon in 1980, 17-year-old Isabelle made her way home through the quiet streets of a small village in northern France. A delicate white box of fresh lemon tarts rested gently in her hands, the sweet buttery aroma floating behind her like a warm promise. She hummed a soft, carefree tune as she thought about her mother's bright smile and the steaming cup of tea that would be waiting for her on the kitchen table. For these last few precious moments, her world felt perfectly safe, gentle, and beautifully ordinary. Isabelle was just steps away from her front door when a white van pulled over, and a woman with a kind face asked for directions to the local church. The woman looked lost and tired. Isabelle stepped closer to the window to help, because that was the kind of person she was. In that 1 second of selflessness, the door swiped open and the shadows swallowed her whole. The lemon tarts scattered across the wet pavement. A mother's tea grew cold on the table. Today I'm going to tell you 12 stories with the theme of the early 80s and the dark secrets that defined a decade. But before we get into the details, if you are a fan of weird, dark, and mysterious things told in story form, please kindly sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their coffee with decaf right before their biggest meeting of the year. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Okay, now let's get to today's stories. The month was December, and the year was 1980, in the rugged heart of the French Ardennes forest. The air was a thick blanket of gray mist that seemed to cling to the damp bark of the ancient oak trees. You could hear the constant, rhythmic dripping of melting frost hitting the forest floor. The scent of rotting pine needles and cold iron hung heavy in the atmosphere. A pale, weak light struggled to break through the canopy of the dense timber. But here is the thing about this specific part of the woods. There was a low, unnatural hum that vibrated through the soil every few hours as the wind caught the mouth of a nearby limestone cavern. It sounded like a long, drawn-out breath coming from deep within the earth itself. It was a sound that most locals chose to ignore because it felt like a warning they were not yet ready to hear. The silence that followed always felt far too heavy and permanent. Now, a man named Michel Fourneret stepped out of a mud-streaked utility van parked on a narrow dirt shoulder. He was 38 years old and possessed a face that was remarkably forgettable in its plainness. Michel was a man who took immense pride in his mechanical skills and his ability to fix anything with a motor. He moved with a slow, deliberate precision as he popped the hood to check the oil. He looked like any other hard-working tradesman in France. And so, he wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag and looked toward the distant lights of the nearby town. Michel was known among his neighbors as a quiet and somewhat rigid individual who kept his lawn perfectly manicured. He was the type of person who would spend hours organizing his toolbox by size and function. This obsession with order was his defining trait. He never raised his voice, and he always paid his taxes exactly on time without a single delay. Isabelle was a 17-year-old student with hair the color of spun wheat and a laugh that could brighten the darkest room in the village. She spent most of her evenings tucked away in the corner of the local library, dreaming of becoming a history professor. Her backpack was always overflowing with heavy textbooks and handwritten notes. She was the pride of her family because she was the first one in 3 generations to have a real chance at a university degree. Except that Isabelle's true passion was not just books, but the small acts of service she performed for everyone she met. Every Friday morning, she would stop by the elderly neighbor's house to deliver fresh eggs from her family's farm. She would sit on the porch and listen to the same stories about the Great War for hours without ever looking at her watch. She had a way of making people feel like they were the only person in the world who mattered to her. But there was one item Isabelle cherished more than anything else in her possession. It was a simple, hand-knit scarf made of soft blue wool that her grandmother had finished just weeks before she passed away. Isabelle wore it every single day regardless of the weather because it felt like a physical hug from the person she missed the most. The scarf was bright and cheerful against the drab colors of the winter. It was her constant anchor to her happy past. I will be honest with you because this always makes me silent for a moment. This particular story is one that lingers in the back of my mind whenever I see a stranger asking for help on a lonely road. It reminds me that the world is often not what it seems to be. There is a specific kind of heaviness that comes with knowing that a person's kindness was the very thing used against them. It is a weight that never truly leaves the heart once you hear it. The evening of the abduction was remarkably still, and the sunset was a vibrant wash of orange and purple over the rolling hills. The temperature was dropping fast, but the air inside Isabel's home was filled with the smell of roasting chicken. Her father was sitting by the fireplace reading the evening paper, while her younger brother played with wooden blocks on the rug. The orange glow of the embers cast long and dancing shadows against the floral wallpaper. And so, the house felt like a fortress of safety and warmth against the encroaching night. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway provided a steady and comforting heartbeat for the entire family. Isabel's mother was humming a soft melody while she set the table for 4 people. She placed the blue ceramic plates down with a gentle click. Everything was in its proper place. There was no reason to believe that the world was about to break. Isabel was walking down the main road where the street lamps had just flickered to life. The light was a soft amber that reflected off the damp asphalt like gold. She felt the soft wool of her grandmother's scarf tucked snugly around her neck. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of her boots on the pavement. She was only 5 minutes away from the front gate of her home. The smell of the wood smoke from the nearby chimneys was comforting and familiar. Except that a white van was idling at the intersection with its headlights dimmed to a low glow. As Isabel approached the vehicle, she noticed a woman sitting in the passenger seat who looked distressed. The woman rolled down the window and called out in a shaking voice. She said she was looking for a specific doctor because her baby was sick. Isabel stopped instantly because she could never ignore a person in need. She leaned in toward the open window. The sound of the sliding door was like a gunshot in the silence of the street. Hands reached out from the darkness of the van and pulled Isabel inside before she could even draw a breath to scream. The blue wool scarf was yanked tight. The lemon tarts fell to the ground in a messy heap of yellow cream. The van sped away into the night, and the amber street lamps continued to glow as if nothing had happened. The road was empty once again. You are lying on the cold metal floor of a moving vehicle, and your vision is blurry from the sudden impact. Your hands are searching for a door handle or a latch, but there is nothing but smooth and unforgiving steel beneath your fingertips. Every time the van hits a bump in the road, a sharp pain shoots through your shoulder. You try to speak, but the fabric of your own favorite scarf is stuffed into your mouth. You realize that no one is coming to help you. The investigation would eventually reveal a truth that was far more sinister than a simple kidnapping by a lone predator. It turned out that Michel Fourniret had entered into a literal blood pact with the woman in the van, who was his wife, Monique Olivier. She had agreed to act as his bait in exchange for his loyalty. The anchor object of the blue scarf was found years later in a hidden compartment under the floorboards of their home in the Ardennes. Michel Fourniret was officially charged with the murders of 7 young women and girls in a French courtroom in the year 2008. He was handed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole by the presiding judge. Monique Olivier was convicted of complicity in the murders and received a life sentence with a 28-year minimum. Isabel's family attended every single day of the trial. Her father never spoke a word. Now, the dark irony of this pact was that Monique Olivier believed her cooperation would keep her husband devoted only to her. She thought that by helping him hunt, she was securing her own place as the center of his world. But the reality was that Michel viewed her as nothing more than a tool in his kit. He had no more love for her than he did for the van he used to transport his victims. They both ended up in cold cells forever, separated by the law. Michel Fourniret died in a prison hospital in the year 2021 due to complications from respiratory failure and Alzheimer's disease. As of 2026, Monique Olivier remains incarcerated at the Ensisheim Detention Center, where she is reported to be in declining physical health and extreme isolation. Recent DNA technology has linked them to several more cold cases that were once thought to be unsolvable mysteries. The heavy silence of the French prison cells feels worlds away from the rugged and beautiful coastline of Western Canada. The mist of the forest is replaced by the salt spray of the Pacific Ocean, hitting the jagged rocks of the shore. In the early 80s, another predator was beginning his own hunt in the suburban neighborhoods of British Columbia. This man did not use a wife as bait, but instead used the promise of quick cash and easy work to lure the innocent. The date was July 16th in the year 1981 in the coastal city of Coquitlam, British Columbia. You could hear the distant, rhythmic barking of a neighbor's dog echoing across the suburban cul-de-sac. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint, metallic tang of salt water coming off the nearby Fraser River. The afternoon sun cast a warm, hazy orange glow over the manicured lawns and the rows of identical ranch-style homes. But there was a subtle, unsettling stillness that seemed to settle over the neighborhood as the shadows began to stretch toward the forest edge. A local resident noticed that the usual sound of children playing at the park had been replaced by a low, persistent humming of a transformer on a power pole. It was a vibrating drone that felt like it was rattling the teeth of anyone who stood still for too long. This tiny deviation in the daily routine felt like a held breath. Now, a man named Clifford Olson walked out of a small rental home and stepped into his car with a heavy, purposeful stride. He was 41 years old and possessed a loud, boisterous energy that often made people feel exhausted just by standing near him. Clifford was a man who spent a great deal of his time in local bars, telling tall tales about his supposed connections to organized crime. He moved with a restless, jerky motion like a coiled spring. And so, he adjusted his sunglasses and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Clifford was known to his associates as a petty thief and a frequent liar who would do anything for a bit of attention. He was the kind of person who would always insist on buying the first round of drinks, just to ensure that he had a captive audience for his stories. This desperate need to be seen as a big shot was the core of his entire being. 12-year-old Simon Partington was a boy who loved the outdoors more than anything else in the entire world. He spent his summer mornings exploring the local creeks and collecting smooth river stones that he would carefully polish until they shone like glass. His room was a makeshift museum of natural wonders and hand-drawn maps of the woods behind his house. He was a quiet child who found more comfort in the rustle of leaves than in the noise of a crowded classroom. Except that Simon also had a very practical side and was determined to save enough money to buy a new 10-speed bicycle. He took on every odd job he could find, from weeding gardens to washing the mud off the neighbors' cars for a few cents a time. He kept his earnings in an old tin can hidden under his bed, counting the coins every single night before he went to sleep. He was a boy who understood the value of hard work and the sweet taste of independence. But there was one specific thing that Simon was most proud of during that long and hot summer of 1981. He had promised his mother that he would save up enough to buy her a special box of chocolates for her upcoming birthday in August. He would talk about it constantly while they were doing the dishes together in the evening. He wanted to see the look of surprise on her face when he presented the gift. It was his greatest and most secret mission. Now, I have to tell you that this part of the story always makes my chest feel tight because of the sheer unfairness of it all. There is something truly haunting about a child who is working so hard for a beautiful goal, while a shadow is watching from the curb. It makes me realize how fragile our sense of safety really is when we are just going about our daily lives. I often find myself thinking about those polished river stones and the boy who never got to finish his map. The morning of the disappearance was bright and clear, with a gentle breeze blowing off the mountains. The smell of frying bacon filled the kitchen as Simon's mother flipped pancakes on the griddle. The sound of the morning news played softly on the radio in the background. Simon sat at the wooden table, swinging his legs and talking about a new trail he had found near the bridge. The light through the window caught the golden flecks in his eyes as he laughed. And so, the house was a sanctuary of love and normal routine, where the biggest worry was whether the milk was fresh. The ticking of the kitchen timer provided a cheerful rhythm to the start of the day. Simon's mother kissed the top of his head and told him to be home by 5 for dinner. He grabbed his baseball cap and ran out the door with a wave. He was a boy who felt like the entire summer belonged to him and him alone. The world was full of promise. Simon was walking along the edge of the park, where the tall grass met the gravel path of the main road. The air was filled with the sweet scent of wild clover and the buzzing of honeybees in the heat. He felt the weight of a few quarters in his pocket as they jingled with every step. He was headed toward the local corner store to see if they needed any help with the morning deliveries. The path was familiar and he had walked it 1,000 times before that day. Except that a dark car pulled up alongside him and a man with a wide, friendly smile leaned out of the driver's side window. The man held up a crisp $10 bill and asked Simon if he wanted to earn it by helping him move some light boxes in the next neighborhood. It was a massive amount of money for a 12-year-old boy in 1981. Simon thought of the chocolates for his mother and the bicycle. He hesitated for only a second before he stepped closer. The sound of the car door locking was a sharp, final click that seemed to echo through the empty street. The man's friendly smile vanished instantly and was replaced by a cold, dead stare that made the hair on the back of Simon's neck stand up. The car began to accelerate away from the park and toward the highway. The $10 bill was shoved back into the man's pocket. Simon looked out the window at the familiar trees as they began to blur into a green wall. You are sitting in a small, windowless interrogation room, and the air is thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and cold coffee. Across from you sits a man who is leaning back in his chair with a look of absolute triumph on his face. He is telling you that he knows exactly where the bodies are buried, but he will not say a word until you agree to pay his wife. You have to decide if you can live with the idea of giving a monster a fortune to bring the children home. The investigation would eventually lead to a revelation that shocked the entire nation of Canada to its very core. It turned out that Clifford Olson had negotiated a deal with the provincial government to pay his family $10,000 for each body he located. This anchor object of the $10 bill was the very bait he used to lure his victims into his car. The authorities were forced to choose between justice and the closure of the grieving families. Clifford Olson was officially charged with the first-degree murders of 11 children and teenagers in a courtroom in 1982. He was handed 11 concurrent life sentences by the presiding judge in a hearing that was filled with the cries of the victims' families. The payment of $100,000 to his wife was kept in a trust fund despite the public outrage. No one could believe that a killer had managed to profit from his own crimes. Now, the dark irony of this situation was that Olson believed his cleverness would make him a legend in the criminal underworld. He thought he had outsmarted the system and secured a future for his family through the blood of the innocent. But the reality was that the government immediately passed new laws to ensure that no criminal could ever profit from their story again. He spent the rest of his life as a pariah, hated even by the men he shared a prison with. Clifford Olson died of cancer in 2011 while serving his sentence at Archambault Penitentiary in Quebec. To this day, Olson's law remains a permanent part of Canadian law, preventing any criminal from receiving compensation for their crimes. The names of his victims are now commemorated in a quiet park, where only the sounds of children playing can be heard. The trust was eventually seized by the court. The cold, hard cash that defined the Olson case feels like a heavy weight compared to the suffocating stillness of a construction site. The salt air of British Columbia is replaced by the humid and stagnant heat of a midnight shift in Manila. In the early 80s, a different kind of greed was building a monument out of wet and hardening cement. This project was not about profit for a family, but about the desperate vanity of a regime that refused to stop for the dead. The date was November 17th in the year 1981 in the coastal district of Pasay, Manila. You could hear the constant, industrial roar of heavy diesel generators vibrating against the humid night air. The atmosphere was thick with the acrid smell of curing lime and the fine gray dust of pulverized rock that coated everything in sight. A harsh, white glare from the stadium floodlights cut through the darkness to illuminate the site. But there was a subtle, rhythmic thudding that seemed to pulse through the scaffolding every few minutes as the massive pumps moved liquid concrete into the upper levels. A young apprentice noticed that the steel support beams were sweating a strange, oily substance that smelled like rusted copper. It was a chemical discharge that felt slick and dangerous to the touch of any bare hand. This tiny mechanical failure was a signal that the structure was under a strain it could not hold. Now, a construction worker named Danilo stepped onto the second-floor platform with a heavy sack of reinforcement bars over his shoulder. He was 32 years old and possessed hands that were as rough and scarred as the bark of an ancient mahogany tree. Danilo was a man who spent 18 hours a day in the sweltering heat just to ensure his children could go to a private school. He moved with a slow, steady endurance that earned him the respect of the entire crew. And so, he wiped the sweat from his brow with a tattered cloth and looked up at the skeletal frame of the Manila Film Center. Danilo was known among the workers as a man of few words who would often share his modest lunch with anyone who had forgotten their own. He was the type of person who would hum a quiet lullaby to himself when the night shift became too grueling to bear. This quiet resilience was the only thing that kept him standing after weeks without a day of rest. Danilo lived in a small, one-room shack on the outskirts of the city, where the walls were covered in the crayon drawings of his 3 young daughters. He spent his few hours of sleep dreaming of the day he would finally finish the house he was building for them in his home province. His primary motivation was a sense of duty that was so deep it felt like a physical weight in his chest. He was the provider and the protector of a future he was building with his own 2 hands. Except that Danilo also possessed a very sentimental side that he kept hidden from the other men on the construction site. He carried a small, laminated photograph of his wife and children in the front pocket of his overalls, tucked right against his heart. Whenever he felt his strength fading, he would reach in and feel the smooth plastic edge of the picture to remind himself why he was there. It was his most precious possession and his only real connection to a world outside the mud. But there was one specific dream that Danilo spoke about whenever the crew took their short midnight break under the stars. He wanted to take his family to the very building he was helping to construct once it was finally finished and the international celebrities had arrived. He wanted them to walk across the polished floors and know that their father had placed the very stones they were standing on. He wanted to see his daughter's eyes widen with wonder at the beauty of it all. Now, I'll be honest with you. This part of the story always makes me feel a profound sense of anger toward the people in power. There is something deeply disturbing about a man who pours his soul into a monument of culture only to be treated as a disposable piece of equipment. It makes me realize that sometimes the most beautiful buildings are built upon a foundation of absolute cruelty. I often think about that photograph and the man who just wanted his children to be proud. The night of the collapse was unusually still, and the air was so heavy with moisture that it felt like breathing through a wet sponge. The sound of the midnight whistle echoed across the bay as the new shift began their work on the upper theater levels. Danilo sat on a wooden crate and took a single sip of lukewarm water from his plastic canteen. The orange glow of his small cigarette was the only light in the corner of the site. Everything felt heavy and ready to break. And so, the construction site was a hive of frantic activity, where the pressure to meet a political deadline outweighed every safety protocol in the book. The ticking of the project manager's watch provided a cold and unforgiving rhythm to the pouring of the cement. Danilo stood up and adjusted his tool belt, feeling a strange tremor in the floor beneath his boots. He looked at the man next to him, but the roar of the machinery drowned out any chance of a warning. Danilo was standing directly beneath the main support arch when the first bolt snapped with a sound like a lightning strike. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of splintering wood and the terrifying screech of twisting steel. He felt the platform drop 5 inches in a single second as the wet concrete above began to leak through the cracks. He reached for the nearest column, but the entire world was already tilting into the abyss. The light vanished in a cloud of gray dust, except that a massive section of the scaffolding gave way completely and sent hundreds of tons of liquid cement cascading down like a tidal wave. Danilo was thrown into the pit along with dozens of his co-workers as the heavy sludge filled their mouths and noses. The sound of the collapse was heard for miles across the city, followed by a silence that was even more terrifying. The project was now a graveyard of wet gray mud that was hardening by the minute. You are standing at the edge of the pit, and you can hear the muffled screams of the men trapped beneath the surface of the wet concrete. Your superior is standing behind you with a cold, expressionless face and a radio in his hand. He tells you that the First Lady has ordered the project to be finished in 3 days, and there is no time for a rescue. You have to decide if you will order the trucks to pour more cement over the living to hide the evidence of the failure. The investigation would eventually be suppressed by the regime, leaving the families of the missing with no answers and no bodies to bury. It turned out that the tomb was intentionally created to keep the construction on schedule for the International Film Festival. This anchor object of Danilo's family photograph was recovered decades later by a maintenance crew who found it sealed behind a false wall in the basement. It remained perfectly preserved in its plastic. No official charges were ever filed against the architects or the political figures who ordered the construction to continue over the dead in 1981. The Manila Film Center was completed in just 72 hours following the tragedy, according to official government records. The exact number of workers entombed in the foundation remains unknown, though local survivors claim the count was over 160 souls. No memorial was ever built. Now, the dark irony of this project was that it was designed to be a Parthenon of the Philippines that would showcase national pride and artistic excellence. But the reality was that the building was so poorly constructed and so laden with bad omens that it was abandoned by the film industry shortly after it opened. It became a global symbol of the very corruption and vanity it was meant to hide. The voices of the dead became the only story anyone ever told. The Manila Film Center still stands today as a decaying and haunted shell near the edge of the bay. It is currently managed by the local government, though large sections of the lower levels remain permanently flooded and off-limits to the public. Security guards frequently report the sound of rhythmic tapping coming from inside the concrete walls. This site serves as a grim reminder that some foundations are built on more than just stone. The suffocating smell of wet cement that filled the Manila night feels like a physical weight compared to the sharp and acrid sting of industrial acid. The humid air of the Philippines is replaced by the blistering and dry heat of a prison corridor in Bihar, India. In the early 80s, a different kind of darkness was being dispensed by those sworn to uphold the law. This was not a failure of engineering, but a systematic and intentional blinding of the defenseless. The date was October 20th in the year 1980 in the district of Bhagalpur within the state of Bihar, India. A relentless and oppressive heat hung over the dusty streets of the town. You could hear the constant, dry scratching of crows in the neem trees. The air was filled with the pungent smell of old court documents and the scent of parched earth waiting for rain. A hazy and yellow sunlight slanted through the windows of the central jail. Now, a local lawyer named Sukhdev Singh walked through the heavy iron gates of the prison with a leather satchel tucked under his arm. He was a man of 52 years who moved with a careful and deliberate gait. Sukhdev was known for his habit of stopping to polish his spectacles every few minutes until they were perfectly clear. He believed that a man should always see the world exactly as it is. This commitment to clarity was his most defining character trait. Umesh Yadav was a 24-year-old farmer who lived in a small village surrounded by fields of waving grain. Every time I tell this story, I still feel a heavy weight in my chest because of how quickly a life can change. He was the kind of man who would stop his tractor in the middle of a hot afternoon just to help an elderly neighbor carry a heavy load of firewood. Umesh had a gentle way of speaking that made even the most nervous animals feel calm in his presence. And so, he spent his mornings working the soil with a sense of pride that only a man who loves his land can understand. He knew the exact texture of the dirt and how it felt between his fingers when the moisture was just right for planting. Umesh would often sing traditional folk songs to his oxen as they moved together in a perfect, slow dance across the hills. He was a man who found his greatest joy in the simple and honest rhythm of the changing harvest seasons. Umesh lived in a small, whitewashed house with a thatched roof that he had repaired himself after the last heavy rains. Every evening before the sun went down, he would sit on his porch and share a cup of hot tea with his young wife. They would talk about their plans to buy another small plot of land so they could grow enough vegetables to sell at the market. He wanted to build a future where his children would never have to worry about where their next meal was from. But here's the thing about Umesh. He was known in the village for a specific and quiet act of humanity that occurred every single winter. He would take a portion of his own grain harvest and secretly leave it on the doorsteps of the widows in the community who had no one else to provide for them. He never sought any recognition for this and would often pretend he had no idea where the food had come from. He believed that a good deed done in secret was the only kind. Except that his favorite part of the day was the very end, when the air turned cool and the fireflies began to dance in the tall grass. He would sit with his wife and describe the way the moon looked as it rose over the distant river. His last words to her before the authorities took him into custody were a promise that he would be back in time to fix the leaking roof before the monsoon arrived. He squeezed her hand and smiled with a look of pure and honest hope. The prison corridor was remarkably quiet as the evening shadows began to lengthen across the cold stone floor. A distant and melodic sound of an evening prayer drifted through the high-barred windows of the cell block. The air inside the holding area was finally starting to cool down from the daytime heat. Umesh sat on his thin mat and watched a small spider weaving a complex web in the corner. He felt a sense of relief that his trial was only a few short days away. And so, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to dance as the light from the flickering lanterns outside moved with the breeze. The only other sound was the heavy and rhythmic breathing of the other men who were sharing the cramped space. Umesh leaned his head against the damp wall and closed his eyes, imagining the smell of the jasmine flowers that grew around his front door. He felt a deep sense of peace, despite the iron bars that surrounded his body. The ticking of a clock in the guard's station provided a steady heartbeat for the long and lonely night. Every few minutes, the sound of a heavy metal bucket being dragged across the floor would break the silence. The scent of wood smoke and cooked lentils drifted in from the street, reminding Umesh of the home he was so desperate to return to. He believed that the law was a fair and just system that would eventually recognize his innocence and let him go back. But here is the thing that Umesh noticed as the heavy footsteps of the guards approached his cell door at midnight. One of the officers was carrying a small black medical kit that appeared to be completely out of place for a routine nightly check. As the officer opened the kit, Umesh heard the faint and unmistakable clinking of metal against glass. There were no bandages or medicine bottles visible inside the velvet lining. Instead, he saw a long and pointed bicycle spoke. The guards entered the cell without saying a single word and moved with a terrifying and practiced efficiency. One of them held a small glass bottle filled with a clear and shimmering liquid that looked like water from the Ganges River. They called it Gangajal, which means holy water, but the smell that came from the bottle was acrid and burnt the back of the throat. Umesh tried to back away into the corner, but there was nowhere left for him to hide in the dark. The heavy iron door swings open with a terrifying screech. You hear the guards shouting orders to hold him down as they move toward the back of the cell. 4 men pin your arms to the floor, while a 5th man sits on your chest to stop you from breathing. You feel the cold and sharp point of the metal spoke pressing against your eyelid. A liquid fire begins to pour into your vision. Everything turns into a blinding and searing white heat. You try to scream for help. You are a prisoner in the cell directly across the hallway, and you are watching through the bars as the guards perform their ritual. You realize that the law you once believed in has been replaced by a group of men who think they are gods. You have to decide if you will risk your own safety to speak out about what you are seeing, or if you will stay silent to survive the night. The smell of the acid fills the air, and you know that your turn is coming very soon. Step back and look at the systematic mechanism of this tragedy that the local police force called justice. This was a ritualized act of violence, where sulfuric acid was used to punish those they deemed to be criminals without the need for a trial. The anchor object of the bicycle spoke was used to puncture the eye before the acid was poured in to ensure the damage was permanent. This was an intentional act of state-sponsored torture designed to instill absolute terror. The Supreme Court of India issued a landmark ruling regarding the Bhagalpur blindings in the year 1981. 15 police officers were officially suspended and charged with various counts of intentional assault and torture. Umesh Yadav was one of 31 men who were permanently blinded during this period in the central jail. The court ordered that the state provide a monthly pension to each of the victims for the remainder of their lives as compensation. Now, the dark irony of this situation was that the police claimed they were cleaning the streets of crime to protect the innocent people of Bihar. They believed that by taking the law into their own hands, they were creating a safer society for everyone. But the reality was that their actions destroyed the very foundation of justice they were supposed to represent. They did not stop the criminals, but instead became the most feared predators in the entire region of the state. In the present day, the Bhagalpur case remains a foundational lesson in human rights law within the Indian judicial system. Umesh Yadav lived the rest of his life in a world of shadows, unable to ever see the faces of his children or the harvest he once loved. The central jail has been significantly restructured, with modern oversight and video surveillance to prevent any repeat of such brutality. The man who once saw the world clearly now navigates by sound. The jagged and cruel justice dispensed in the dark of an Indian prison cell feels like a nightmare compared to the organized brutality of a paramilitary unit. The dry heat of Bihar is replaced by the humid and murky waters of the Tula River in Mexico. In the early 80s, another group of men in uniform decided that they were the ultimate judges and executioners. This was not a secret act in a cell, but a mass execution that would soon float to the surface. The date was January 14th in the year 1981 in the bustling district of Colonia Libertad, Mexico City. You could hear the constant, frantic honking of taxicabs echoing through the narrow streets as the city began to wake up. The air was thick with the heavy scent of diesel exhaust and the sweet smell of fried dough from the corner vendors. A hazy yellow smog clung to the tops of the colorful buildings. Now, A man named Jose Luis moved through the crowded market stalls with a heavy wooden crate of oranges balanced on his shoulder. He was 29 years old and possessed a wide, toothy grin that seemed to never leave his face regardless of the heat. Jose was the kind of person who knew every single merchant in the district by their first name. He moved with a quick and energetic step that made him stand out in the morning crowd. And so, Jose spent his early mornings working as a delivery driver to support his mother and his 3 younger sisters who lived in a small apartment nearby. He would often wake up at 4 in the morning to ensure he could get the best prices on produce before the rest of the city had even opened their eyes. His sisters would wait for him by the window every evening just to see what small treats he had brought home. He was their hero. The sound of his heavy boots on the cobblestone streets was a familiar rhythm to the people who lived along his route. Jose would often stop to help an elderly woman carry her groceries up a steep flight of stairs without ever being asked. He had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of his extended family. He believed that a man was defined by the way he treated his neighbors when no one else was watching him work. Jose was known for a quiet and persistent act of humanity that occurred every single Tuesday afternoon without fail. He would set aside a portion of his daily earnings to buy a warm meal for a homeless veteran who sat outside the local church. He never asked for anything in return and would often sit on the curb to chat with the man for a few minutes. He believed that no one in his neighborhood should ever have to go a single night hungry. Except that Jose had a very specific dream that he shared with his mother while they sat at their small wooden table in the evenings. He was saving every spare peso he could find to buy a small plot of land in his home village in the countryside. He wanted to build a house with a large garden where his sisters could run free without the noise of the city. He would describe the color of the flowers he wanted to plant with deep excitement. But there was one item that Jose carried with him everywhere he went, as a symbol of his hard work and his future goals. It was a small and heavy gold-plated cigarette lighter that he had found in a dusty antique shop months ago. He did not even smoke, but he loved the way the metal felt in his hand and the way it caught the light. He told his friends that the lighter was a reminder that even a small light can shine in the darkness. The scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the small apartment as Jose sat down for his morning meal that Tuesday. His mother would always make sure he had a hot plate of beans and eggs before he headed out into the chaotic streets. The sound of a radio playing soft bolero music provided a background for their quiet conversations about the upcoming weekend. Everything felt normal and safe in the early light of 1981. And so, he kissed his mother on the cheek and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. The hallway was filled with the sound of children getting ready for school and the smell of floor wax. Jose hummed a cheerful tune as he walked down to the street where his small delivery truck was parked. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life he was building. The sun was warm on his face as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The afternoon was particularly humid, and the air felt like a warm, wet blanket pressing against the skin of his forearms. You could hear the distant and rhythmic sound of a church bell tolling for the 4 o'clock service. The light was a soft and golden hue that turned the dusty streets into a scene from a dream. Jose sat in his truck and took a deep breath of the air. He felt a sense of deep satisfaction with his life and his hard work. The world outside the truck window was a blur of colors and sounds that felt like a beautiful and familiar symphony. The smell of blooming bougainvillea drifted in through the open window and mixed with the scent of the fresh fruit in the back. Jose felt the smooth metal of the gold lighter in his pocket and smiled to himself as he thought about his sisters. He was exactly where he wanted to be at that moment. There was no sign of the shadow. But here's the thing about that specific intersection in the Colonia Libertad. The sound of tires screeching on the pavement was the first thing that broke the absolute peace of the afternoon. Jose looked in his side mirror and saw 3 black unmarked cars with tinted windows pulling up behind his truck. He noticed that the drivers were wearing dark sunglasses and had a rigid and military posture. A cold and sudden feeling of unease washed over him. The unmarked cars blocked his path with a precision that was both professional and terrifying to witness. Jose tried to put the truck in reverse, but a 4th vehicle slammed into his bumper from behind, pinning him in place. The sound of the metal crunching was loud and final. He saw men in dark uniforms jumping out of the cars with their weapons held at the ready. He put his hands in the air and tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't work. The car doors fly open. You hear the heavy thud of combat boots on the asphalt. Men in dark uniforms surround the truck with their weapons drawn and focused on your chest. You feel a gloved hand grabbing your collar and pulling you out onto the street. Your face hits the scorching pavement. You see the black boots of the men as they stand over you in a circle. You cannot breathe. The world is spinning. They throw you into the back of a dark van. You are sitting in the back of a moving van, and you are holding a heavy rifle across your lap. You can hear the muffled sounds of the men you just arrested as they struggle against their plastic zip ties on the floor. Your commander tells you that these men are dangerous criminals who deserve no mercy and no trial today. You have to decide if you will follow the orders to drive to the riverbank or if you will listen to the voice in your head. The investigation would eventually reveal a truth that was far more sinister than a simple arrest of a criminal gang. It turned out that the men in the van were innocent civilians who had been snatched off the street to cover up a multi-million-dollar robbery committed by the police. The Jaguar 1 unit had been ordered to eliminate witnesses and create a diversion. The victims were taken to a secluded area near the Tula River and executed in cold blood. Step back and look at the cold investigative facts of what the local residents would later call the Rio Tula massacre. The anchor object of the gold-plated cigarette lighter was the very thing that revealed the brutal truth of the crime. When the bodies were discovered floating in the river months later, a young investigator found the lighter buried in the thick mud. It was still clutched in the hand of one of the victims who had fought to the very end. Arturo Durazo Moreno was officially charged with multiple counts of corruption and murder by a Mexican federal court in the year 1984. He was arrested after a massive international manhunt and was eventually sentenced to a long term in a maximum security prison. The court determined that the 12 victims of the Rio Tula massacre had been systematically tortured and executed. Jose Luis was officially cleared of any wrongdoing in the case. Now, the dark irony of this tragedy was that Durazo Moreno had built a reputation as a man of absolute law and order who was cleaning up the city. He claimed that the Jaguar 1 unit was the elite sword of justice that would finally end the reign of criminals in the neighborhoods. But the reality was that he was the biggest criminal of them all, and he used the power of the state to murder the very people he was sworn to protect. He died in prison. Time has marched on. The site of the Rio Tula massacre is marked by a small and weathered stone monument that bears the names of the 12 victims. Jose Luis's mother still visits the river every year to place a single orange on the bank in memory of her son. The Mexico City police force has been through decades of reform, but the ghost of the Jaguar 1 unit still haunts the halls. The lighter is currently kept in a national museum. The cold and murky water of the Tula River feels like a mirror to the dark and hidden hungers that can consume a human soul. The smell of the river mud is replaced by the scent of sawdust and fresh timber in a construction yard in Bauru, Brazil. In the early 80s, another man was hiding a secret that was far more visceral and terrifying than political corruption. This was a hunger that could not be satisfied by money, but only by a dark betrayal. The date was July 4th, in the year 1981, in the industrial city of Bauru, deep within the state of São Paulo, Brazil. You could hear the constant, hollow clanging of hammers against steel coming from the new housing developments on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the heavy scent of freshly cut pine and the dry, red dust that settled on every surface like a fine powder. A pale, hazy sunlight filtered through the smog of the nearby factories. Now, a man named Benedito de Oliveira worked on a scaffolding high above the street with a trowel in his hand and a bucket of gray mortar at his feet. He was 39 years old and possessed a physical strength that seemed almost impossible for a man of his average height. Benedito was known for his ability to lay bricks with a speed and precision that left the younger men on the crew exhausted. He moved with a mechanical and tireless energy that few could match. And so, he spent his long days quietly building the walls of the city while the other workers joked and complained about the heat. Benedito was the kind of man who would never join in the tavern talk after a shift, preferring instead to head straight back to his modest rooming house. He was seen by his neighbors as a deeply religious and humble individual who spent his weekends volunteering at the local church. He was the very picture of a stable and hardworking citizen. The sound of his heavy leather boots on the gravel path was a familiar sound to the residents of the neighborhood where he lived. Benedito would often pause his walk to greet the local shopkeepers with a polite nod and a soft-spoken word of encouragement. He had a way of blending into the background of the city so perfectly that most people forgot he was even there once he passed them. He believed that a quiet life was the best defense against the chaos of the world. Paulo was a 9-year-old boy who lived just 3 doors down from the construction yard where Benedito was currently employed. He was a child with bright, inquisitive eyes and a pocket that was always bulging with his collection of translucent blue glass marbles. He spent his afternoons sitting on the curb and practicing his aim against the cracks in the sidewalk. Paulo was the kind of boy who could find a whole world of adventure in a single handful of colored glass. Except that Paulo was also known for his incredible kindness toward the stray animals that roamed the alleys of Bauru. He would save the crusts from his sandwiches every single day to feed a mangy, yellow dog that waited for him by the park gates. He would talk to the animal as if it were his best friend, telling it all about the school lessons he had learned that morning. He was a boy who felt a deep and natural connection to every living creature he encountered. But there was one specific thing that Paulo cherished more than any other object in his small world. It was a single large marble that was a deep cobalt blue with a white swirl in the center that looked like a tiny trapped cloud. He called it his lucky eye, and he would squeeze it tight whenever he felt a little bit nervous or lonely. He believed that as long as he had the marble in his pocket, nothing bad could ever truly happen to him in the streets of his town. I'll be honest with you, this detail about the lucky marble is the part of the story that always makes me want to stop talking for a moment. There is a specific kind of heartbreak that comes from seeing a child's innocence condensed into a tiny piece of glass. It makes me realize that we all have these small anchors of safety that we cling to, never realizing how easily they can be lost. I often think about that blue swirl and the boy who trusted it so completely. The afternoon of the disappearance was remarkably warm, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of ripening mangoes from the trees in the courtyard. The sound of a distant soccer match on a transistor radio provided a joyful background for the children playing in the street. Paulo sat on his front steps and polished his lucky marble with the hem of his shirt until it sparkled in the sun. He felt a sense of complete and total peace as he watched the world go by. And so, the neighborhood felt like a place where everyone looked out for one another, and the doors were rarely locked during the day. The ticking of the clock in the kitchen provided a steady heartbeat for Paulo's mother as she prepared the evening meal. She could hear her son's laughter from the porch, and it made her smile as she chopped the vegetables for the soup. Everything was in its proper place. There was no reason to suspect that a predator was nearby. Paulo was walking toward the park to find his yellow dog when he saw a familiar face leaning over a pile of bricks near the construction site. It was the quiet man from down the street, the one who always nodded hello at the church on Sundays. Benedito looked up and smiled, holding out a small wooden box that he said contained a rare kind of stone he had found while digging. Paulo stopped instantly because he was always curious about the treasures of the earth. Except that as Paulo stepped closer to look inside the box, the quiet man's hand moved with a sudden and violent speed that no one would have expected. The blue marble fell from Paulo's hand and rolled into a dark sewer grate with a soft clinking sound. Before the boy could even make a sound, he was pulled behind the tall wooden fence of the yard, and the world went dark. The yellow dog waited at the park gates until the sun went down, but his friend never arrived. You are standing in the middle of the street, and the sun is beginning to set, casting long and jagged shadows across the pavement. You have called your son's name 100 times, but the only answer is the sound of the wind whistling through the empty construction site. You see a single, familiar blue marble lying just out of reach beneath a heavy iron grate. You have to decide if you will walk into the dark yard alone, or if you will run for the police to help you. The investigation would eventually lead the police to a small, hidden cellar beneath the floorboards of Benedito's modest room. It turned out that the uncontrollable hunger he spoke of was a horrifying reality that involved the systematic murder and consumption of at least 9 people. This anchor object of the blue marble was not found in the yard, but was discovered weeks later inside a small jar on Benedito's bedside table, alongside other trophies from his victims. Benedito de Oliveira was officially charged with 9 counts of homicide and desecration by a Brazilian criminal court in the year 1982. He was handed a sentence of 30 years in prison, which was the maximum penalty allowed under the law at that time. The court records from Bauru detailed a series of crimes so visceral that the local community refused to speak his name for decades. Paulo's mother was present when the final verdict was read. Now, the dark irony of this case was that Benedito claimed he was a man of God who was being tested by a hunger he did not ask for. He believed that by volunteering at the church and being a perfect citizen, he was balancing the scales of his own internal darkness. But the reality was that his mask of sanity was only a tool he used to gain the trust of the most vulnerable people in his neighborhood. He died behind bars, never having tasted the freedom he craved. By this juncture, the rooming house where Benedito lived has been torn down and replaced by a small community garden. The city of Bauru has become a major hub for technology and education, but the story of the cannibal remains a whispered legend among the older generation. A small memorial plaque for the victims was placed in the local park near the gates where the yellow dog once waited. The memory of Paulo's blue marble remains a symbol of lost luck. The heavy and stagnant silence of a Brazilian prison cell feels like a weight compared to the frantic and paranoid atmosphere of the Pomeranian woods. The red dust of Bauru is replaced by the gray and freezing mist of the Polish countryside. In the early 80s, another man was using a blunt instrument to carve his name into history. This was not a hunger for flesh, but a sadistic need for power that would eventually earn him the nickname of the Scorpion. The date was May 19th in the year 1981 in the coastal region of Pomerania, Poland. You could hear the constant, low moan of the Baltic wind whipping through the skeletal remains of the winter trees. The air was filled with the bitter smell of burning coal and the damp, metallic tang of the sea spray. A weak and gray morning light struggled to penetrate the heavy fog that had settled over the rolling farmland and the industrial outskirts of the city. Now, a man named Paweł Tuchlin walked through the tall grass of a secluded meadow with a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He was 35 years old and possessed a quiet, almost timid demeanor that made him appear completely harmless to the casual observer. Paweł was a man who spent his days working as a farmhand and occasional locksmith, moving with a slow and deliberate pace. He was known for being a reliable worker who never complained about the long hours in the sun. And so, he spent his evenings returning home to his wife and children in a small, tidy apartment where the smell of cabbage soup always filled the hallway. Paweł was the kind of father who would spend hours patiently helping his son fix a broken toy or reading a story to his daughter before bed. To his neighbors, he was the very definition of a stable, hard-working family man. He seemed like the last person in the country who would ever cause a moment of trouble or fear. The sound of his heavy leather boots on the gravel path was a comforting and predictable rhythm to the people who lived in his building. Paweł would often stop to hold the door for the elderly women in the complex, offering a polite tip of his hat and a shy smile. He had a way of blending into the background of society so perfectly that most people forgot his name the moment he walked away. He believed that being invisible was the greatest gift a man could ever possess. Maria was a 22-year-old librarian who lived in a small village just a few miles from the Baltic coast. She was a woman with a deep and quiet passion for the smell of old parchment and the feel of leather-bound books in her hands. She spent her days carefully cataloging the local history collection, often losing track of time as she immersed herself in the stories of the past. Maria was the kind of person who found more life in a library than in the noisy town square. Except that Maria was also known for her incredible devotion to her father, who had fallen ill and required constant care in their modest home. She would spend her meager salary on the best medicines she could find, often skipping meals herself to ensure he had everything he needed. She would sit by his bedside every evening and read him poetry until he fell into a peaceful sleep. She was a daughter whose love was a physical force that kept their small family together. But there was one specific dream that Maria cherished more than any other goal in her quiet and selfless life. She was saving every spare zloty to buy a small, portable radio so that her father could listen to the classical music broadcasts from Warsaw during the day. She would describe the beautiful melodies to him, promising that soon the house would be filled with the sound of violins and pianos. It was the one luxury she was determined to provide for his happiness. Now, I'll be honest with you, this detail about the radio is the part of the story that always makes me feel a profound sense of sadness. There is something truly moving about a young woman working so hard to bring a little bit of beauty into a sick man's world, while a shadow is circling the outskirts of her village. It makes me realize that we often focus on the big events of history, while the most important battles are fought in the quiet corners of a home. The evening of the encounter was unusually cold, and the air was so thick with moisture that it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. The sound of the evening train whistling in the distance provided a lonely background for the few people walking the streets of the village. Maria wrapped her thin coat tightly around her shoulders as she left the library, thinking about the warm fire she would build for her father. Everything felt heavy and ready for the winter. And so, the village felt like a safe and familiar harbor, where the only real danger was the biting wind coming off the sea. The ticking of the clock in the library had been the only heartbeat Maria had heard for hours as she finished her work. She stepped out onto the cobblestone path and took a deep breath of the salt air, feeling a sense of accomplishment for another day of hard work completed. There was no reason to suspect that the darkness was watching her. Maria was walking along the edge of the forest, where the tall pines cast long and jagged shadows across the road. The air was filled with the sharp scent of resin and the sound of dry needles crunching beneath her boots. She felt the weight of her small coin purse in her pocket, knowing she was finally close to having enough for the radio. She was only 10 minutes away from her front door when she noticed a man standing by a broken fence, looking lost in the mist. Except that as Maria stepped forward to ask if he needed help, the man turned with a speed that was both shocking and predatory. The light from a distant window caught the edge of a heavy metal object he was pulling from his canvas bag. Before she could even draw a breath to scream, the world exploded into a blinding flash of white light and a searing pain that radiated through her skull. The sound of the wind was the last thing she heard as she hit the cold earth. The sound of a heavy blow hitting bone echoes through the trees. You feel a sudden and sickening weightlessness as your legs give out beneath you. A wave of intense heat washes over the back of your head, while the smell of iron and wet leaves fills your nose. You try to reach out for something to hold on to, but your fingers only find the freezing mud of the forest floor. You cannot see anything but a dark and shifting blur. You realize that the silence has returned. You are walking through the dark woods, and you can feel the heavy weight of the locksmith's hammer in your hand. You hear the soft gasping of the person lying at your feet, and it fills you with a sense of power that you have never felt in your quiet life. You have to decide if you will walk away now and return to your family as if nothing has happened, or if you will finish what you started in the shadows. The cold Baltic wind is the only witness to your secret. Step back and look at the sadistic mechanism of the man the Polish authorities would eventually call the Scorpion. Paweł Tuchlin did not kill for money or for revenge, but for the raw and terrifying thrill of the act itself. The anchor object of the locksmith's hammer was the tool he used to bridge the gap between his life as a family man and his existence as a predator. He was able to operate for nearly a decade because his crimes were hidden by the chaos of the era. Paweł Tuchlin was officially charged with 11 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder by a Polish criminal court in the year 1985. He was handed a sentence of death by hanging following a trial that revealed the true extent of his decade-long reign of terror. The court documents detailed a series of attacks that were marked by extreme and senseless brutality. Maria was one of the few who survived the initial strike, but lived in fear. Now, the dark irony of this case was that Tuchlin believed his mundane and helpful personality made him a superior kind of human being. He thought that by being a good father and a reliable worker, he was earning the right to indulge in his darkest impulses in the shadows. But the reality was that his mask of sanity was the only thing that allowed him to destroy the lives of innocent people for so long. He was executed in the year 1987 in Gdansk. The case of the Scorpion remains one of the most studied psychological profiles in the history of Polish criminology. Paweł Tuchlin's apartment has long since been renovated and occupied by new families who have no memory of the man who once lived there. The locksmith's hammer is currently held in a police museum as a grim artifact of a dark era. The memory of the Scorpion still serves as a warning about the evil in the ordinary. The cold and calculated violence of a Polish farmhand feels like a mirror to the suppressed and hidden horrors of the Romanian countryside. The gray mist of Pomerania is replaced by the jagged and ancient peaks of the Transylvanian mountains. In the early 80s, another man was using a blunt instrument to terrorize a population that was already living in fear of the state. This was not just a lone killer, but a secret that the regime was desperate to keep buried. The date was March 10th in the year 1980 in the city of Cluj, nestled within the cold and jagged peaks of the Transylvanian mountains in Romania. You could hear the constant, low-pitched groan of steam pipes vibrating beneath the cobblestone streets. The air was filled with the bitter, choking scent of coal soot and the smell of damp, frozen earth thawing in the morning sun. A pale and sickly gray light filtered through the industrial haze of the factory chimneys. Now, a man named Romulus Verus walked toward the central rail station with a heavy toolbox gripped tightly in his calloused hand. He was 41 years old and possessed a quiet, stoic face that seemed to blend perfectly with the drab, concrete walls of the city. Romulus was a man who spent his days as a boiler technician, moving through the dark basements of apartment blocks with a silent and practiced efficiency. He was known as a man who never wasted a single word. And so, he spent his evenings tucked away in a small, windowless room where the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a metal alarm clock. Romulus was seen by his coworkers as a reliable, if somewhat distant, employee who always arrived exactly 5 minutes before his shift began. He was the kind of person who would spend hours meticulously cleaning his tools until the steel sparkled like new. This obsession with cleanliness was the only hint of the internal order he craved. The sound of his heavy work boots on the wet pavement was a predictable and steady beat that the local shopkeepers ignored as he passed. Romulus would often stop at the same street corner to buy a single loaf of black bread, nodding politely to the baker without ever making eye contact. He had a way of occupying space without ever drawing attention to his presence. He believed that the most powerful man in a room was the one whom nobody could remember after the door closed. Elena was a 24-year-old seamstress who worked in a massive textile factory on the edge of the city. She was a woman with a quick, nimble intelligence and a secret passion for creating intricate embroidery patterns inspired by old folk tales. She spent her days surrounded by the deafening roar of industrial looms, dreaming of the day she could open her own small shop. Elena was the kind of person who could see beauty in the most ordinary scraps of colorful fabric. Except that Elena was also known for her fierce and quiet devotion to her younger sister, whom she was supporting through a prestigious music school in the capital. She would work double shifts and skip her own meals, just to ensure that her sister had the best violin strings and the sheet music she required. She would write long, encouraging letters every single Sunday night by the light of a single candle. She was a sister whose love was a hidden and steady flame. But there was one item that Elena cherished more than any other tool in her sewing kit. It was a heavy, vintage brass thimble that had belonged to her grandmother, engraved with a tiny image of a soaring eagle. She wore it like a ring even when she was not working, feeling the cool weight of the metal against her skin as a reminder of her family's resilience. She believed that as long as she wore the thimble, her hands would remain steady and her heart would stay brave. Now, I have to tell you that this part of the story always makes me feel a deep sense of frustration with the way history is recorded. There is something truly tragic about a young woman building a future for her family, while the state around her is more interested in its own image than her safety. It makes me realize that silence can be just as deadly as any weapon. I often think about that brass thimble and the hands that worked so hard to create something lasting. The morning of the final shift was bitterly cold, and the air was so thick with fog that the street lamps looked like distant, blurry ghosts. The sound of a heavy factory whistle signaled the start of the day, echoing across the valley with a mournful and lonely tone. Elena wrapped her thick wool coat tightly around her shoulders as she stepped out of her apartment, feeling the bite of the wind. She felt a sense of quiet determination as she began her long walk to work. And so, the city felt like a fortress of socialist order, where every person had a designated place and a specific task to perform for the state. The ticking of the clock in the factory break room was the only heartbeat Elena heard during her short lunch of cold soup and bread. She sat in the corner and traced the eagle on her thimble, imagining her sister's violin music filling a grand concert hall. Everything was normal. There was no sign that the piece was a lie. Elena was walking through a narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut between the housing blocks and the industrial zone. The air was filled with the sharp, metallic scent of rusted iron and the sound of a dripping water pipe somewhere in the darkness. She felt the heavy weight of her thimble in her pocket, as she always did when she walked alone in the early morning. She was only 3 minutes away from the factory gate when she heard a heavy footstep behind her. Except that as Elena turned to look back, she saw a man stepping out from behind a pile of discarded industrial scrap with a heavy hammer in his hand. The man's face was a mask of cold, mechanical focus that looked exactly like the boiler technician she had seen in the basement of her own building. Before she could even draw a breath to scream, the hammer swung with a violent and terrifying speed that seemed to crack the very air. The gray world vanished instantly. The sound of the heavy metal hitting the brick wall next to your head is the last thing you hear clearly. You feel a sudden and sickening jolt of electricity racing down your spine as the first blow lands on your shoulder. A wave of blinding heat washes over your vision while the smell of wet concrete and iron fills your nose. You try to reach out for the wall to stay upright, but your legs feel like they are made of water. You realize that the shadow has caught you. You are standing in the dark alleyway, and you can feel the vibrating hum of the heavy hammer in your hand as the metal rings against the bone. You hear the soft, frantic gasping of the person at your feet, and it fills you with a sense of order that the state has never been able to provide. You have to decide if you will strike one more time to finish the work, or if you will fade back into the fog before the police arrive. The city is silent, and no one is coming. Step back and look at the cold mechanism of the man the Romanian regime tried to pretend did not exist. Romulus Verus was a serial killer who targeted women with a hammer, but because the communist government claimed crime did not exist in a perfect society, they suppressed the truth. The anchor object of the brass thimble was found clutched in Elena's hand when her body was discovered, but the official report stated she had simply fallen from a high industrial ladder. Romulus Verus was officially apprehended and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder by a Romanian court in the year 1980. He was judged to be legally insane and was handed a sentence of permanent confinement in a high-security psychiatric hospital. The court proceedings were kept entirely secret from the public to prevent any panic among the population. He remained in the Stay psychiatric facility for the remainder of his natural life. Now, the dark irony of this case was that the Romanian state believed their silence was a form of protection for the people. They thought that by classifying murders as accidents, they were maintaining the illusion of a peaceful and safe socialist utopia for everyone. But the reality was that their cover-up allowed a monster to continue his hunt for nearly a decade without any interference. The very system meant to protect the workers was the one that fed them to the Ripper. Romulus Verus died of natural causes in the year 1993, while still being held at the Stay Psychiatric Institution in Transylvania. But the declassified files of the Securitate have revealed that he was responsible for at least 5 deaths and many more brutal assaults. Elena's sister eventually became a famous violinist, but she never learned the true cause of her sibling's death until the revolution changed the laws. The heavy, stifling silence of a Romanian state cover-up feels like a weight compared to the frantic and bloody streets of a city in rebellion. The smell of coal soot in Cluj is replaced by the acrid sting of tear gas and the scent of gunpowder in Gwangju. In the early 80s, another group of people were being systematically erased from history by those in power. This was not the work of a lone killer, but a mass tragedy that a whole nation was forced to forget. The date was May 18th in the year 1980 in the city of Gwangju, South Korea. You could hear the constant, rhythmic ringing of a morning bell from a nearby temple echoing through the narrow alleys. The air was filled with the heavy scent of steamed rice and the faint, sweet smell of blossoming ginkgo trees. A cool and pale blue light began to creep over the tiled roofs of the quiet residential neighborhoods as the city prepared to wake up for the day. But there was a subtle, low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the pavement every few minutes like distant thunder on a perfectly clear day. A local shopkeeper noticed that the stray dogs had all retreated into the shadows under the porches and were refusing to come out for their morning scraps. It was a silence that felt heavy and expectant, as if the world was holding its breath. This tiny deviation in the morning routine was a warning that the residents were not yet ready to hear. Now, the wind shifted slightly and brought with it a faint and metallic scent of diesel and grease from the direction of the main highway. A group of elderly men sitting on a wooden bench noticed that the usual flock of pigeons in the town square had vanished without a trace. The temperature began to rise as the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, but the air remained strangely stagnant. The light hitting the white concrete of the buildings felt sharper and more aggressive. Minho was a 20-year-old university student who sat at a low wooden table in his family's small kitchen. He was carefully dipping a thin bamboo brush into a bowl of black ink, his hand moving with a slow and steady grace as he painted a birthday scroll for his mother. Minho was known for his incredible patience and his ability to sit for hours without making a single sound. He moved with a quiet and deliberate focus that made him appear much older than his actual years. And so, he spent the first hour of every morning grinding his own ink against a heavy stone block that had belonged to his grandfather. He believed that the preparation of the ink was just as important as the calligraphy itself, because it allowed him to clear his mind of all distractions. The sound of the stone rubbing against the water was a rhythmic and soothing scratch that filled the quiet room. He would close his eyes and focus on the feeling of the wood in his hand. But here is the thing about the brush he was using that morning. It was a simple bamboo tool with a handle that had been worn smooth by years of constant use. The bristles were made of fine wolf hair, and they held the ink with a precision that allowed for the most delicate of lines. Minho treated the brush with a level of reverence that most people reserved for holy relics. He would wash it in cool spring water after every session and hang it to dry on a special rack. Except that his mother would often watch him from the doorway, leaning against the frame with a proud and tired smile. She had raised him alone after his father had passed away when Minho was just a small boy. She had worked long hours in the vegetable market to ensure that he had the best supplies and a proper education. She would tell him that his hands were a gift from the heavens and that he should use them to bring honor to their family name in the city. And so, he made sure to help her at her market stall every Saturday without ever being asked to do so. He would arrive before dawn to help her unload the heavy crates of Napa cabbage and radishes from the back of a delivery truck. Minho would use his calligraphy skills to write out beautiful price signs on scraps of cardboard, turning the humble stall into a work of art. The other vendors would often stop by, just to admire his elegant and flowing script for hours. Minho would also take it upon himself to deliver groceries to the elderly women in the neighborhood who lived alone in the high apartment blocks. He would carry the heavy bags up 4 flights of stairs and refuse to take a single coin for his trouble. He would stay for a few minutes to talk about the weather or to ask after their health, making sure they felt seen and cared for. He believed that a community was only as strong as the way it treated its weakest members. But the most important project in his life was the scroll he was finishing for his mother's 50th birthday celebration. He had spent weeks selecting the perfect poem about the resilience of a mother's love and the strength of a family bond. He wanted the ink to be so dark and deep that it would never fade even after 100 years of sunlight. He pictured her face when she unrolled the paper and saw his dedication written in the language of the masters. Now, he also spent his free time at the university library, studying the history of democratic movements around the world. He was a young man who believed in the power of words to change the hearts of men and the course of nations. He would often engage in long and passionate debates with his fellow students about the importance of freedom and the right to self-governance. Minho was not a fighter by nature, but he possessed a moral core that was as hard as iron. Except that his greatest dream was much smaller and more personal than the politics of the capital. He wanted to open a small calligraphy school in his neighborhood, where he could teach the local children the value of discipline and beauty. He envisioned a quiet room filled with the smell of ink and paper, where the chaos of the outside world could be forgotten for a few hours. He believed that by teaching others to create, he was helping to build a more peaceful world. Every time I tell this story, I still feel a heavy weight in my chest when I think about how much potential was contained in that one young life. It reminds me that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a record of the dreams that were cut short by the hand of violence. I find myself wondering what kind of teacher Minho would have become, and how many children he would have inspired. It is a silence that always makes me stop and think for a moment. The walk from his home to the university campus took him past a small park where a group of children were playing tag in the grass. He stopped for a second to watch them and felt a deep sense of happiness at the sound of their laughter. The air was filled with the scent of pine needles and the distant smell of charcoal fires from the neighborhood kitchens. He adjusted the strap of his bag and continued on his way, feeling the warm sun on the back of his neck. But the final words he spoke to his mother as he left the house that morning were a simple promise to be back early. He told her that he had found a special kind of tea at the market that he wanted her to try during their evening meal together. He squeezed her hand and told her that she was the most important person in his world. She watched him walk down the street until he turned the corner, his white shirt glowing in the bright morning light of the spring day. The kitchen was a sanctuary of absolute peace, where the steam from the rice cooker swirled in the golden shafts of sunlight hitting the floor. The sound of a neighbor's radio playing a soft traditional folk song provided a comforting and familiar background for the morning chores. Minho's mother sat at the table and traced the lines of the scroll her son had left behind, feeling a deep sense of pride. The air was warm and smelled of toasted sesame seeds. And so, the house felt like a fortress of safety where the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the quiet rooms. The smell of jasmine flowers from the garden drifted in through the open window and mixed with the scent of the drying ink on the table. Minho's mother moved with a slow and rhythmic grace as she prepared the side dishes for their dinner, enjoying the simple and predictable routine of her day. Everything was exactly as it should be. The light in the hallway was a soft and buttery yellow that made the old wooden floors glow with a sense of history and warmth. There was no reason to believe that the world outside was anything but peaceful and safe for a young man going to the library. The community felt like a large family where everyone knew each other's names and stories. The afternoon was moving forward with a sense of leisurely safety that made the coming storm feel like an impossibility. But here is the thing about that specific afternoon in the center of Gwangju. A small and static-filled radio broadcast suddenly cut to a government announcement that declared a state of emergency across the entire province. The voice on the speaker was cold and metallic, warning citizens to stay indoors and avoid all public gatherings. A neighbor's door slammed with a violent force that echoed down the street. The birds in the trees suddenly stopped their singing. The sound of heavy metal tracks grinding against the asphalt is the first thing you hear from the direction of the town square. You feel a sudden and sharp sting in your eyes as a cloud of acrid tear gas drifts through the narrow alleyway. A line of soldiers in dark green uniforms moves toward you, with their bayonets fixed and glinting in the sun. You cannot see the faces of the men behind the gas masks. The screaming of the crowd becomes a deafening and chaotic wall. And so, the air is suddenly filled with the sound of rubber batons hitting flesh and the frantic shouting of people trying to escape the enclosure. You feel the vibration of the heavy trucks in the soles of your boots as they move to block the exits of the streets. The light of the setting sun turns the dust in the air into a thick and red haze that makes it impossible to breathe. You reach out for a hand to hold, but there is only the cold metal of a riot shield in your way. The world becomes a blur of motion and sound as the first shots are fired into the air over the heads of the students. You feel a sharp and searing pain in your shoulder as you are pushed to the ground by the surging crowd. The smell of gunpowder and wet pavement fills your nose, and you realize that the rules of the world have changed in a single heartbeat. You try to call out for help, but your voice is lost in the roar of the armored vehicles moving toward the center. You are running through the crowded hallways of the municipal hospital, and your feet are slipping on the wet and red tiles of the floor. You pull back a white sheet from a long row of bodies and pray that the face beneath is not the one you have loved for 20 years. You have to decide if you will go back out into the line of fire to search for your son, or if you will stay in the safety of the morgue to wait for a miracle. You realize that the rice is cold. Step back and look at the cold mechanism of the tragedy that the South Korean government would later call the Gwangju Uprising. The paratroopers were ordered to use lethal force against their own citizens to suppress a call for democracy that they labeled as a communist riot. The government actively suppressed all news of the massacre to maintain the image of national stability. They buried the truth along with the bodies in shallow graves outside the city limits. The anchor object of the bamboo calligraphy brush was found tucked inside Minho's pocket when his body was finally recovered from a mass grave months later. It was still stained with the dark ink of the birthday scroll he had been working on that final morning in the kitchen. The brush was a silent witness to a life that had been dedicated to beauty and peace, but was ended by a regime that feared both. It was returned to his mother in a small wooden box. Chundu Hwan was officially charged with mutiny and treason by a South Korean court in the year 1996 for his role in the massacre. He was handed a sentence of death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment by the president of the country. The court determined that at least 165 people were killed, while thousands more were injured or went missing. Minho was officially recognized as a martyr in the year 2002. The dark irony of this tragedy was that the regime claimed they were protecting the nation from a hidden enemy that was threatening to destroy their way of life. They believed that by labeling students and farmers as traitors, they were securing a future of order and prosperity for everyone. But the reality was that their own cruelty became the catalyst for the very democracy they were trying to prevent. The names of the dead became the foundation of a new country. Minho's mother still lives in the same small house where she keeps the unfinished birthday scroll displayed in a glass case. Fast forward to today, the 518 Memorial Foundation maintains the digital archives that prove the identities of the victims through advanced genetic mapping. The current government of South Korea has issued a standing apology and has integrated the history of the massacre into the national curriculum for all schools. The man who once commanded a nation with an iron fist spent his final days confined to a single room where the only voice he heard was the echo of his own fading memory. Chun Du-hwan died in the year 2021 from multiple myeloma at his home in Seoul. He never issued an apology and was in a state of cognitive decline. The 518 archives are officially inscribed in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. The vibrant and colorful murals of Gwangju feel like a world away from the rigid and sun-bleached stones of a parade ground in Cairo. The smell of ginkgo trees is replaced by the scent of desert dust and the smoke of celebratory cannon fire. In the early 80s, another nation was gathering to witness a display of military power that was meant to honor a great leader. This parade was about to begin on October 6th in the year 1981 in the city of Cairo, Egypt. The date was October 6th in the year 1981 in the sprawling and ancient city of Cairo, Egypt. You could hear the constant and deafening roar of French-made Mirage jets screaming across the clear blue sky in tight formation. The air was thick with the scent of hot desert sand and the faint, bitter smell of cordite from the celebratory cannon fire. A blinding and white sunlight reflected off the limestone monuments of the dusty city. Now, the wind kicked up a fine layer of grit that settled onto the polished surfaces of the military vehicles lining the parade route. A group of spectators noticed that the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt made the distant rows of soldiers look like a shifting and unstable mirage. The temperature was climbing toward 90 degrees, but the crowd remained tightly packed along the steel barriers. The light was so intense it seemed to bleach the color from the flags. And so, the vibration of the heavy tank treads began to rattle the glass in the windows of the nearby government buildings. A young boy sitting on his father's shoulders noticed that the pigeons had all abandoned their perches on the rooftops and were flying in frantic circles. It was a physical sensation of power that felt both impressive and slightly overwhelming to the people watching. This grand display of force was meant to celebrate a great victory and a new era. Anwar Sadat was a 62-year-old man who stood before a tall mirror in his private dressing room that morning. He was carefully adjusting the collar of his stiff military tunic, his hands moving with the steady confidence of a statesman who had survived decades of political turmoil. Anwar was known for his incredible charisma and a voice that carried a deep and resonant authority. He moved with a quiet and dignified grace that commanded immediate respect. But here is the thing about the man who was leading his nation through a period of massive change. He spent the first hour of every single day in silent prayer, seeking the wisdom to keep his people safe in a region of the world that rarely knew a moment of rest. He believed that his primary mission in life was to ensure that the next generation would never have to experience the horror of another war. This commitment to peace was his most defining trait. Except that his wife Jaehan would often stand in the doorway and watch him with a mixture of pride and a lingering sense of worry. She had seen the threats that were whispered in the shadows of the city, and she knew the weight of the burden he carried every single hour. She would often tell him that his heart was too big for a world that was often so small and cruel. Anwar would just smile and remind her that a leader must always be a servant to his people. Anwar made sure to spend time with his children every evening before the sun went down, regardless of how busy his schedule had become. He would sit in the garden and tell them stories about the history of their ancestors, teaching them that true strength was found in forgiveness rather than in the sword. He believed that by nurturing their spirits, he was helping to build a more compassionate and stable country. He wanted them to grow up in a world without borders. Anwar would also take it upon himself to visit the small villages in the countryside, where the farmers worked the land much as they had for thousands of years. He would sit on the dirt floors of their homes and listen to their concerns about the price of grain or the health of their livestock. He refused to let the walls of the palace disconnect him from the daily struggles of the common man. He believed that the strength of the nation was found in the soil. But the most important project in his life was the peace treaty he had signed with a neighboring nation that many believed was an impossible dream. He had spent years navigating the complex and dangerous waters of international diplomacy, risking his own reputation and his life for a chance at a lasting harmony. He wanted the borders to be open and the sounds of construction to replace the sounds of heavy artillery. He envisioned a future of shared prosperity. Now, he also spent his free time reading the works of the great philosophers and poets, seeking a deeper understanding of the human condition. He was a man who believed in the power of the written word to bridge the gaps between different cultures and religions. Anwar was not a man of violence, but he possessed a moral courage that allowed him to stand alone against the tide of public opinion. He was a visionary who saw a world that did not yet exist. Except that his greatest dream was much smaller and more personal than the politics of the Middle East. He wanted to retire to a small house by the sea, where he could spend his days writing his memoirs and playing with his grandchildren in the sand. He envisioned a quiet life filled with the smell of the salt air and the sound of the waves hitting the shore. He believed that after a lifetime of service, he had finally earned a moment of absolute and total peace. This particular story always makes me feel a heavy weight in my chest because of the sheer irony of a man who died for the peace he worked so hard to create. It reminds me that sometimes our greatest strengths are the very things that make us the most vulnerable to the darkness of the world. I find myself wondering if he knew the risks he was taking that day, or if he truly believed he was safe. It is a thought that always makes me silent for a moment. The drive from the palace to the parade grounds took him past the cheering crowds that lined the streets for miles. He sat in the back of an open-top limousine and waved to the people, feeling a deep sense of pride in the progress they had made together. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of military bands playing upbeat national anthems. He adjusted the ceremonial sash across his chest, feeling the weight of the medals on his tunic. But the final words he spoke to his wife as he left the house that morning were a simple promise to see her for tea in the afternoon. He told her that he felt a sense of immense gratitude for the life they had built together and for the future they had secured for their family. He squeezed her hand and told her that he was the luckiest man in Egypt. She watched his motorcade disappear into the bright morning light of the desert day, feeling a sudden chill. The reviewing stand was a sanctuary of absolute and formal peace, where the high-ranking officials sat in comfortable chairs under a large canopy. The sound of a neighbor's radio playing a soft, traditional folk song was replaced by the rhythmic marching of the elite infantry units. Anwar sat in the center of the front row and watched the display with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The air was warm and smelled of expensive perfume and the fresh starch of uniforms. And so, the stand felt like a fortress of safety, where the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the quiet moments between the passing units. The smell of cold lemonade and mint tea drifted across the rows of dignitaries as they enjoyed the spectacle of the desert power. Anwar moved with a slow and rhythmic grace as he leaned over to talk to the vice president, enjoying the simple and predictable routine of the day. Everything was fine. The light under the canopy was a soft and golden yellow that made the polished brass of the metals glow with a sense of history and success. There was no reason to believe that the men in the parade were anything but loyal soldiers of the Republic. The atmosphere was one of celebration and national unity, where everyone seemed to be part of the same story. The afternoon was moving forward with a sense of leisurely safety that made the coming storm impossible. But here is the thing about that specific afternoon in the heart of the city. A military truck in the parade suddenly ground to a halt directly in front of the reviewing stand, its engine backfiring with a sound like a small explosion. The soldiers in the back of the truck did not wait for an order but jumped out with their weapons held at the ready. A cold and sudden feeling of confusion washed over the dignitaries. The cheering of the crowd began to falter. The sound of automatic gunfire is the first thing you hear as the lead assassin moves toward the stand with a terrifying focus. You feel a sudden and sharp sting in your eyes as a cloud of smoke and dust rises from the impact of the grenades hitting the pavement. A group of men in military uniforms is charging toward your position with their bayonets fixed and glinting in the sun. You cannot see the faces of the men behind the sights of their rifles. And so, the air is suddenly filled with the sound of lead hitting the wooden chairs and the frantic shouting of people trying to dive for cover. You feel the vibration of the heavy feet on the stairs as the attackers climb the steps of the reviewing stand with a lethal precision. The light of the setting sun turns the dust in the air into a thick and red haze that makes it impossible to see clearly. You reach out for your weapon, but it is too far away to reach. The world becomes a blur of motion and sound as the first bullets strike the center of the front row. You feel a sharp and searing pain in your shoulder as you are pushed to the ground by the force of the impact. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal fills your nose, and you realize that the world you knew has vanished in a single heartbeat. You try to call out for the security detail, but your voice is lost in the roar of the shouting and the chaos. You are standing on the edge of the platform, and you can see the assassins moving through the smoke with a mechanical and cold efficiency. You hear the clicking of the empty magazines as they reload their weapons for a final volley of fire. You have to decide if you will throw your own body over the president to shield him or if you will return fire into the crowd. You realize that the man who wanted peace is now lying in the middle of a war zone. Step back and look at the cold mechanism of the tragedy that the world would later call the assassination of Anwar Sadat. The members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad had infiltrated the military and used the cover of the parade to get within striking distance of their target. The government was unable to prevent the strike because the killers were wearing the same uniforms as the men assigned to protect the leader. They used the noise as a perfect shield. The anchor object of the ceremonial sash was found soaked in red when the medics finally reached the fallen leader in the middle of the stand. It was the very item that Anwar had insisted on wearing despite the warnings that a bulletproof vest would be more appropriate for such a public event. The sash was a silent witness to a man who chose to represent his office with dignity rather than with fear. It was returned to his grieving family in a dark box. Khalid Islambouli was officially charged with the murder of the president and several others by an Egyptian military court in the year 1981. He was handed a sentence of death and was executed by firing squad in the year 1982 following a trial that lasted several months. The court determined that the plot was fueled by religious extremism following the signing of the peace treaty. Anwar was officially buried in a grand tomb. The dark irony of this tragedy was that the assassins claimed they were acting to save the soul of the nation from a leader they believed had betrayed their heritage. They thought that by removing the man who signed the treaty, they would bring an end to the peace they so deeply despised. But the reality was that the peace treaty outlived Anwar Sadat and remains a cornerstone of the regional stability. His death only served to solidify his legacy in history. Anwar's wife Jehan lived for 40 more years, dedicating her life to the causes of women's rights and the promotion of the peace her husband had started. The memorial site in Cairo is a place of quiet reflection for people from all over the world who value the courage of a visionary. The current government maintains a high level of security, but the spirit of the dialogue remains open for the next generation of leaders. The man who once believed he could change the world with a single signature now rests beneath a heavy stone monument that bears his name and his titles. Jehan Sadat died in the year 2021 from an undisclosed illness at a hospital in Cairo. She was buried next to her husband with full military honors. The peace they built is still standing, but the cost of that foundation was a life of service. The heavy and formal silence of a presidential tomb feels like a weight compared to the frantic and desperate energy of an urban uprising. The smell of desert sand is replaced by the scent of wood smoke and the acrid sting of gunpowder in the streets of Bulawayo. In the early 80s, another group of people were discovering that the end of one war was only the beginning of another. This was not a parade, but a battle for the soul of Zimbabwe. The date was November 9th in the year 1980 in the suburb of Entumbane, on the edge of Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. You could hear the constant, rhythmic chirping of the night, insects rising from the tall grass in the vacant lots. The air was filled with the heavy scent of rain on dry dust and the smell of wood smoke from 100 small cooking fires. A soft and purple twilight began to settle over the rows of new brick houses that lined the quiet streets. But there was a subtle, low-frequency vibration that seemed to hum through the souls of anyone standing still near the western perimeter of the housing complex. A local grandmother noticed that the goats in the nearby pen had stopped their constant bleating and were huddled together in a tight, shivering circle. It was a tension that felt heavy and thick, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for a spark. This tiny shift in the evening energy was a silent warning. Now, the wind changed direction and brought with it a faint and metallic scent of motor oil and diesel exhaust from the direction of the nearby military barracks. A group of children playing soccer in the dirt road noticed that the usual birds in the acacia trees had suddenly taken flight in a panicked rush. The temperature began to drop as the sun dipped below the horizon, but the air remained strangely still. The light hitting the corrugated metal roofs looked sharp. Elias was a 34-year-old man who stood in the small dirt yard of his brand-new four-room house. He was carefully polishing a wooden chair he had built from scrap timber, his hands moving with the steady patience of someone who had survived years of hardship. Elias was known for his quiet and gentle spirit, despite the fact that he had spent his youth fighting in the bush for independence. He moved with a slow and deliberate grace that commanded respect. And so, he spent the last hour of every day tending to his small garden where he was trying to grow tomatoes and maize in the stubborn soil. He believed that the act of planting something and watching it grow was the highest form of victory a man could ever achieve. The sound of his shovel hitting the earth was a rhythmic and soothing thud that filled the quiet yard. He would close his eyes and breathe in the smell of the turning dirt with a sense of relief. But here's the thing about the man who was finally living the dream he had fought for during the long war. He spent the first few minutes of every morning sitting on his front step and just staring at the small copper key that sat on his palm. It was the key to his front door, and he treated it like a sacred object that proved he finally belonged somewhere safe. He would wipe the metal with a soft cloth until it glowed like a miniature sun in the morning light. Except that his wife, Sarah, would often stand in the kitchen doorway and watch him with a mixture of pride and a lingering sense of disbelief. They had spent years moving from camp to camp in the mountains, never knowing if they would see the next sunrise together. She would often tell him that his hands were meant for building a life rather than for holding a rifle. Elias would just smile and remind her that they had finally reached the promised land they wanted. Elias made sure to spend time with his two young sons every evening before the lamp was blown out for the night. He would sit on the edge of their bed and tell them stories about the great heroes of their ancestors, teaching them that true bravery was found in kindness. He believed that by nurturing their curiosity, he was helping to build a nation that would never have to know the sound of a gunshot. He wanted them to grow up in a world without the shadows of war. Elias would also take it upon himself to help the other veterans in the suburb who were struggling to adjust to the quiet life of a civilian. He would spend his weekends repairing their roofs or sharing the vegetables from his garden with those who had nothing to eat. He refused to let the bonds of the revolution fade away now that the fighting was supposedly over. He believed that the strength of the new nation was found in the way they cared for their brothers. But the most important project in his life was the small schoolroom he was helping to build in the center of the Entumbane district. He had spent months hauling heavy stones and mixing mortar, risking his own physical health to ensure the children had a place to learn. He wanted the walls to be so strong that they would stand for generations as a monument to their freedom. He envisioned a future where every child in the suburb would be able to read and write. Now, he also spent his free time listening to the news on a small transistor radio, seeking a deeper understanding of the political changes happening in the capital. He was a man who believed in the power of unity and the importance of reconciliation between the different factions of the army. Elias was not a man of politics, but he possessed a deep moral core that allowed him to see beyond the tribal lines. He was a man who truly believed the war was finished. Except that his greatest dream was much smaller and more personal than the building of a new government. He wanted to buy a small cow so that his family could have fresh milk and a little bit of wealth to pass down to his children. He envisioned a quiet life where the only sounds he heard were the lowing of the cattle and the laughter of his family in the yard. He believed that after a decade in the bush, he had finally earned a moment of absolute peace. This particular story always makes me feel a heavy weight in my chest because of the sheer tragedy of a man who thought the danger was behind him. It reminds me that sometimes the ghosts of the past are not finished with us, even when we have buried our weapons in the ground. I find myself wondering if Elias felt the shift in the air that night, or if he truly believed he was safe in his new brick home. It is a thought that always makes me silent for a moment. The walk from his house to the construction site of the school took him past a small market where women were selling bright fabrics and fresh fruit. He stopped for a second to buy a piece of sugarcane for his sons and felt a deep sense of happiness at the vibrant life of the community. The air was filled with the scent of wild jasmine and the distant smell of wood smoke. He adjusted the brim of his hat and continued on his way, feeling the warm sun on his back. But the final words he spoke to his wife as he left the house that morning were a simple promise to be back early to fix the fence. He told her that he felt a sense of immense gratitude for the brick walls that protected them from the wind and the rain. He squeezed her hand and told her that they were the luckiest family in Bulawayo. She watched him walk down the street until he turned the corner, his blue shirt glowing in the bright morning light of the spring. The living room was a sanctuary of absolute and simple peace, where the light from the small window hit the polished floorboards in long golden stripes. The sound of a neighbor's radio playing a soft traditional song provided a comforting and familiar background for Sarah's chores. She sat on the wooden chair Elias had built and traced the grain of the wood with her thumb, feeling a deep sense of security. The air was warm and smelled of floor wax and roasting maize. And so, the house felt like a fortress of safety, where the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the quiet rooms. The smell of blooming flowers from the garden drifted in through the open window and mixed with the scent of the evening meal cooking on the stove. Sarah moved with a slow and rhythmic grace as she prepared the plates for her family, enjoying the predictable routine of her day. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The light in the hallway was a soft and golden yellow that made the brick walls look solid and eternal. There was no reason to believe that the men in the nearby barracks were anything but the guardians of the new republic. The community felt like a massive family where everyone had shared the same struggle for freedom. The afternoon was moving forward with a sense of leisurely safety that made the coming storm feel like a physical impossibility in that moment. But here is the thing about that specific afternoon in the heart of Entumbane. A single sharp crack of a heavy machine gun suddenly echoed across the vacant lots, followed by the terrifying roar of a mortar tube being fired. The voice of a neighbor screaming for her children cut through the air with a violent force. The birds in the trees suddenly took flight in a massive and black cloud. The soft light of the twilight was replaced by the flash of tracer fire. The sound of heavy metal tracks grinding against the dirt is the first thing you hear as the tanks move into the residential streets. You feel a sudden and sharp sting in your lungs as the smell of cordite and burning rubber drifts through the open windows of your home. A line of soldiers in camouflage uniforms is moving toward the houses, with their weapons firing in long and chaotic bursts. You cannot see the faces of the men behind the sights of the guns. And so, the air is suddenly filled with the sound of lead hitting the brick walls and the frantic shouting of people trying to crawl for cover. You feel the vibration of the heavy shells hitting the ground in the soles of your feet as the neighborhood becomes a battlefield. The light of the rising moon turns the smoke in the air into a thick and white haze that makes it impossible to see the road. You reach out for your children, but the world is shaking too hard. The world becomes a blur of motion and sound as the first rocket strikes the roof of the house next door. You feel a sharp and searing heat on your face as the wooden door of your home is splintered by a hail of bullets. The smell of gunpowder and wet plaster fills your nose, and you realize that the peace you loved has vanished in a single heartbeat. You try to call out for Elias, but your voice is lost in the roar of the heavy artillery moving in closer. You are lying on the cold concrete floor beneath your bed, and you are clutching your children to your chest so hard that they cannot breathe. You hear the sound of the brick walls being chewed away by the heavy machine gun fire coming from the street. You have to decide if you will stay in the house and pray that the walls hold, or if you will run into the crossfire to reach the open field. You realize that the copper key is still sitting on the table. Step back and look at the cold mechanism of the tragedy that the world would later call the Entumbane uprisings. The rival guerrilla factions of the Liberation Army turned their heavy weapons on each other in the middle of a housing complex filled with civilians. The government was unable to stop the fighting for days as tanks and anti-aircraft guns were used to settle old political scores. They turned a symbol of hope into a slaughterhouse in 48 hours. The anchor object of the copper key was found melted and fused to the wooden table when the fire was finally extinguished days later. It was the only thing left of the home Elias had built with his own two hands during that first year of independence. The key was a silent witness to a man who had traded his rifle for a future, only to have that future burned to the ground by his own brothers. It was a piece of metal that no longer fit any lock in the world. Robert Mugabe officially consolidated his power following the Entumbane uprisings in the year 1981 by integrating the rival factions into a single national army. The court of history determined that at least 300 people were killed during the clashes, while thousands more lost their homes and everything they owned. Elias was never seen again, and his name was eventually added to the list of the missing from the Matabeleland region. The dark irony of this tragedy was that the soldiers claimed they were fighting to protect the revolution from internal enemies who were threatening to steal their victory. They believed that by eliminating their rivals in the streets, they were securing a future of absolute order for the people. But the reality was that their violence set the stage for a decade of massacres that would devastate the southern part of the country. The brick houses became monuments to grief. The ruins of the Ntombane housing complex were eventually cleared away to make room for new developments, but the soil remains scarred by the memory of the fire. In all the time that has passed, the Ntombane Memorial Site is a quiet and overgrown plot of land where families still come to leave flowers for the missing. The current government rarely mentions the uprisings in official speeches, but the residents of Bulawayo have never forgotten the sound of the tanks. The man who once dreamed of a quiet life with a cow and a garden is now a ghost in the records of a nation that moved on without him. Sarah died in the year 2010 from a broken heart and a long illness at a small clinic in the city. She was buried with the melted copper key in her hand. The peace they wanted was eventually achieved, but the cost of that stability was the soul of an entire generation. The heavy and haunted silence of a Zimbabwean suburb feels like a weight compared to the lonely and vast emptiness of the Australian outback. The smell of wood smoke is replaced by the scent of dry eucalyptus and the metallic tang of a dusty highway. In the early 80s, another young man was setting out on a journey that was meant to be a grand adventure across a continent. This trip was about to begin on a lonely road in the year 1982. The date was November 3rd, in the year 1982, in the coastal city of Townsville, located in the tropical north of Queensland, Australia. You could hear the constant, dry rattling of the palm fronds as a salt-tinged breeze blew in from the coral sea. The air was thick with the scent of sun-scorched asphalt and the sweet, cloying smell of overripe mangoes. A harsh and unforgiving white light beat down on the red dust of the roadside. But there was a subtle, shimmering mirage that seemed to dance over the long stretch of the Bruce Highway, making the distant horizon look like a pool of shifting water. A local truck driver noticed that the usual crows were not scavenging along the shoulder of the road, but were instead perched silently on the power lines. It was a stillness that felt heavy and expectant, as if the land itself was holding its breath. This tiny change in the environment was a warning. Now, a young man named Tony Jones stood on the edge of the gravel shoulder with a heavy canvas backpack resting against his boots. He was 20 years old and possessed a lean, athletic build that spoke of a life spent outdoors in the Australian sun. Tony was known for his infectious laugh and a sense of curiosity that often led him far away from the familiar streets of his home. He moved with a relaxed and confident energy that made people trust him. And so, he adjusted the brim of his hat and looked down the long, empty road that stretched toward the horizon like a ribbon of gray silk. Tony was seen by his friends as a brave and independent spirit who believed that every stranger was just a friend he had not yet met. He was the kind of person who would spend his last few dollars to buy a meal for a fellow traveler without a second thought. This openness was the core of his entire personality. Tony lived in a small apartment in Adelaide where the walls were covered in postcards from all the places he had visited during his short time on Earth. He spent his evenings studying maps of the outback, tracing the routes that would take him from the cold southern coast to the tropical heat of the north. His primary goal for the summer of 1982 was to hitchhike across the continent to meet his brother Tim for a grand adventure in Townsville. Except that Tony also possessed a very disciplined side, and he made sure to call his mother every single week to let her know he was safe. He would describe the people he had met and the beautiful landscapes he had seen with a level of detail that made her feel like she was right there with him. He carried a small notebook where he recorded the license plate numbers of every car that gave him a ride. He was a traveler who understood the value of caution. But there was one specific item that Tony cherished more than any other tool in his travel kit. It was a small, hand-drawn map of the Queensland coast that his brother had sent him in the mail months before the trip began. There was a large red letter X marked over the city of Townsville, representing the finish line of his long journey across the heart of the country. He would look at that map every night by the light of a campfire, feeling the pull of home. Now, I'll be honest with you, This detail about the hand-drawn map is the part of the story that always makes me feel a profound sense of loneliness. There is something truly haunting about a young man carrying a physical symbol of his destination while he is standing in the middle of a vast and empty wilderness. It makes me realize that a map can show us the way, but it cannot protect us from the shadows. I often think about that red X and the brother waiting there. The morning of the disappearance was bright and clear, with a gentle wind blowing through the eucalyptus trees that lined the highway. The sound of a distant tractor provided a peaceful and familiar background for the early morning travelers heading north for work. Tony sat on his pack and shared a piece of fruit with a stray dog that had wandered over from a nearby farm. He felt a sense of complete and total peace as he watched the sun rise over the ocean. And so, the roadside felt like a place of transition, where the only worry was how long it would take for the next car to pull over. The ticking of his watch provided a steady and rhythmic heartbeat for the passing hours as he waited patiently for a ride. Tony hummed a soft tune to himself and adjusted his sunglasses, enjoying the feeling of the warm air on his skin. Everything was normal and safe. There was no sign that the world was about to turn cold. Tony was walking toward a small public telephone booth near the edge of a rest area to make his final call home before reaching his brother. The air was filled with the scent of dry grass and the sound of the wind whistling through the phone lines overhead. He felt the weight of the copper coins in his pocket as he reached for the door of the booth. He was only 2 days away from reaching the red X on his map. He felt a sense of immense accomplishment. Except that as Tony stepped inside the glass booth, he noticed a dark car pulling into the gravel lot with its engine idling at a low and menacing growl. The driver did not get out, but instead sat behind the tinted window, watching the young man through the reflection of the glass. Tony felt a sudden and sharp chill in his spine that had nothing to do with the tropical heat of the morning. He picked up the receiver, but the line was strangely silent and dead. The sound of the heavy car door opening on the gravel is the first thing you hear as you hang up the useless phone receiver. You feel a sudden and sickening jolt of adrenaline as you realize that the rest area is completely empty and the highway is silent. A shadow falls across the glass door of the booth, and you see the reflection of a man standing directly behind you. You cannot see his face because of the glare of the sun. The world begins to feel very small. You are sitting in your living room in Townsville, and you are looking at the clock on the wall for the 10th time in an hour. You have the dinner started and a cold drink waiting for your brother, who was supposed to arrive at the bus station 3 hours ago. You have to decide if you will drive out onto the dark highway to search for him, or if you will wait by the phone for a call that might never come. You realize that the silence in the house is getting louder. Step back and look at the cold mechanism of the mystery that the Australian police would eventually call the disappearance of Tony Jones. For nearly 40 years, the case remained a total void because a crucial statement from a witness who saw Tony being followed was filed in the wrong police department. The administrative error meant that the investigators in Queensland never saw the lead that could have solved the case in 1982. They lost the trail. The anchor object of the hand-drawn map was found tucked inside a pocket of Tony's backpack, which was discovered abandoned in a different part of the state weeks later. The red X was still visible, but the paper was stained by the red dust of the outback and the dampness of the tropical rain. The map was a silent witness to a journey that ended just miles away from the person who loved him the most. It was returned to his brother in a small plastic bag. An official coronial inquest into the disappearance of Tony Jones was finally reopened in the year 2002 by the state of Queensland. The court determined that Tony had most likely been the victim of a homicide shortly after his final sighting in Townsville in 1982. No one was ever officially charged with his murder because the physical evidence had been lost or destroyed over the decades of silence. His body was never found. Now, the dark irony of this cold case was that the very vastness and beauty of the Australian outback became the perfect shroud for a crime that should have been solved. The distance between the police stations and the lack of communication in the early 80s allowed a predator to walk away while the family waited by the phone. The freedom that Tony loved so much was the very thing that made him vanish without a single trace. The map led to nowhere. Through all these years, the case of Tony Jones remains one of the most famous and heartbreaking missing person mysteries in Australian history. The government has maintained a reward of $250,000 for any information that leads to the recovery of his remains. His brother Tim still lives in Townsville and continues to advocate for the search, refusing to let the memory of his younger sibling fade into the red dust. The man who once stood on the side of the road with a map and a dream is now a statistical ghost in the archives of the missing. Tim Jones still keeps the hand-drawn map in a safe place, though the paper is now brittle and the red ink has faded to a pale brown in the year 2026. Advanced satellite imaging and forensic ground-penetrating radar are currently being used to scan the areas near the old rest stops along the Bruce Highway. The lonely and silent roads of the Australian outback feel like a final chapter in a decade defined by secrets and shadows. These 12 stories from the early 80s remind us that the world is often a place of profound beauty and terrifying danger, often existing in the same heartbeat. Whether in the forests of France or the rivers of Mexico, the truth eventually finds its way to the light. Thank you for listening to these tales of the weird and the dark.